So let's get started. Let's teleport ourselves back to the summer of 2001, Liam, when I was a wee 9-year-old and you were a wee 4-year-old.
I hadn't turned 4. I would have been 3.
If you think about that landscape where wrestling was at that stage, WWE had bought WCW, they had bought ECW, Ring of Honor had not been formed yet. Wrestling was in a pretty dire place. You know, it was WWE and everything else was tiny or terrible. And there wasn't a lot of opportunities out there if you couldn't work for WWE, which was a bit of a problem for Jeff Jarrett, given he was publicly fired on the final episode of Nitro, and he held up WWE for 150 grand against China. So he needed places to work. And I think that's like the real genesis of TNA. There'll always be like, oh, you know, there's creating an alternative to give people opportunities in wrestling. But I think push comes to shove. Jeff Jarrett knew he needed somewhere where he could wrestle regularly, and that did not exist in the year 2001, and it didn't exist really in the year 2002 either. We'll talk about a couple of alternatives that popped up and died, but he had to put his money where his mouth is, because otherwise he probably wouldn't have been able to wrestle for the rest of his career. Because obviously he did come back to WWE. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2018 and made an actual in-ring return in the Royal Rumble, and I think it was 2019.
Still has a job there.
And he still has a job there today, indeed. So it wasn't like iced out for the rest of his life, but he was iced out from, 1999 to 2018. That's a pretty long period of not being able to work there.
Hey, Jeff Jarrett stay winning though. Let's give the man credit where it's...
Yeah, the genesis of TNA really does come from he needed somewhere to work, and as I mentioned, there were a couple of alternatives. There was stuff that popped up to try and fill the void post WCW, which was World Wrestling All-Stars, which did a bunch of pay-per-views, many of which were in Australia.
Ah.
Did you go to any of those or hear about any of those?
I was 4.
You might have went to things.
No.
Because it was founded by Andrew McManus, who's a big music promoter. Andrew McManus, by the way, founder of World Wrestling All-Stars, was arrested in Australia in connection with alleged importation of 300 kilograms of cocaine and money laundering in 2015. So...
I'm a fan of that. Fair enough.
Those are the kind of people that were getting into wrestling in the year 2002. So they would have done regular pay-per-views. They would have done weekly pay-per-views, but they would have done like big quarterly pay-per-views with big stars like Randy Savage and Scott Steiner and Sting and Jeff Jarrett. And some of them, like, it was basically a precursor to TNA in a lot of ways. It had a lot of the similar talent, but it was going for these big, like, tentpole pay-per-views as opposed to smaller weekly pay-per-views.
How many shows did they get through?
Oh, I think there was like 10. Let me check.
So you're saying it'd be a fine series for us to track down the World Wrestling All-Star shows?
Yeah, sure. I it would be interesting to watch. Those shows look terrible, but I'm sure you could watch them.
Okay, I'm sure you could watch them.
According to Cage Match, they had 30 shows, which is more than I thought.
Oh,
I think
that's way too much then. I'm not committing to that.
No, I think a lot of them were live events. I think that in terms of pay-per-views, they did a lot fewer, because they did the Reckoning, the Retribution, the Eruption, the Revolution, and the Inception.
Revolution?
So, yeah, wow. I think there was 5...
Trendsetters.
Pay-per-views, which, by the way, their first show, the Inception, in Sydney, has a Cage Match rating of 2.5.
That's good. That's good stuff right there. That's what you want to see.
The main event of which was Jeff Jarrett versus Road Dogg in a cage.
I hope they were playing off of the, 90s WWF angle.
And probably were. That's all they ever did with Jeff Jarrett and Road Dogg. They also had Hoovy against Psychosis in a ladder match. That's not bad, I suppose.
Hoovy, of course, has a very tepid history with Australia.
Yeah, big fan of Australia.
Yeah. And Australian law enforcement.
There was a battle royal that 3 of which of the participants are just question mark on Cage Match, and if the Germans don't know, nobody knows.
It was probably Kangaroo Jim, Outback Bob, and Terry.
So, those shows kind of flopped. They did. They'll just leave that there. You can be racist toward Australia because you're Australian. It's fine.
That's how it works.
World Wrestling All-Stars didn't really get off the ground, and Jeff Jarrett wasn't happy with how that was being run. He thought it should be more episodic. He thought there should be more stories, which informed the kind of product he ended up creating.
Man does love stories.
Yes, that does make wrestling better, usually, to be fair. Give me just matches. You just want your Ring of Honor.
Yeah, I was actually I don't want to keep taking you off of your thing. Just very quickly, but do you ever wonder if your brother had to come back with some Ring of Honor Final Battle 2003 or something?
Some Best of Samoa Joe DVD.
Yeah, would you have been this big ROH guy?
Maybe I would have. Maybe that would have changed the fate of my life forever.
That would have changed the wrestling business forever.
Or maybe I just would have been like, this shit sucks. And I would have just abandoned wrestling forever.
Where's my production value?
I would have been like you burying Chris Hero, being like, this isn't wrestling.
40 minutes. All right, I'll now shut up and let you go through the rest of this.
No, you can derail me all you want. That's the fun. There was also the XWF, which was like Hulk Hogan led, but the big problem was they recorded like a full season of TV and then went to shop it around. But by the time they were like shopping it to networks, Hulk had already gone back to WWF. Kurt Hennig was one of their big stars who already went back to WWF. So they were like going into TV meetings with TV executives, showing them these tapes. It's like that has Hulk Hogan on these shows, which I'm sure would have piqued interest. But then it's like, oh, so he's going to be on the show? It's like, he's on this season. It's like, what about other seasons? And it's like, don't you worry about that.
I think I've seen some of this.
Oh yeah, the DVD's out there. I have it on my shelf here.
Didn't Punk do something with this too?
Well, that would have been very early. It would have been 2001, maybe?
I think maybe it was some undercard stuff. Because it was kind of like another weird proto-TNA thing where it had a lot of indie guys who were like just good wrestlers on the undercard, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
I guess like that was kind of the whole thing of the time, wasn't it? It was like, who can we get? Who's available?
Because that's the thing we're going to talk about when I'm talking about the founding of TNA. It's like just that indie scene, which like there is a lot of very promising young wrestlers coming through. Or you have the likes of Samoa Joe breaking through. You have the likes of Christopher Daniels, who's been there for a decade. He's not a young wrestler, but he's breaking through. Obviously, the Ring of Honor cohort, the likes of the Amazing Red, the likes of Loki, the likes of Bryan Danielson. So like there is a new generation that's coming, but like if you look at the talent landscape in the year 2001, which is even pre Ring of Honor, you're just like, oh god, wrestling is doomed.
Yeah, and also it's like, sure, there's a lot of really good guys on the come up, but like, where are your stars to carry the brand?
That's the other big issue. Like a lot of them were still being paid by WCW, still being paid by Time Warner, so they weren't working anywhere.
And not being willing to drop those contracts in any way. Like, I'm just gonna, or not being able to. It's like, I got nah.
Well, some of them could. That's the thing. DDP gave up his to go work for the Fed, and look how that worked out for him. So a lot of them, like the Steiners and the Bookers, or not the Bookers, the Stings of the world that didn't take the buyouts, and they're just like, we'll just coast here because Time Warner is paying us out for the rest of our contract. And I can't blame them. I'd probably do the same thing.
Well, it worked out for DDP, so.
Yeah, he had a great career in the World Wrestling Federation. So yeah, XWF flopped. World Wrestling All-Stars flopped. There was no real national alternative to WWE in 2002. Obviously, Ring of Honor was founded in February of 2002. February, right? Yeah, February. And, you know, they had their niche. They had their thing, but it was never remotely in the same league as WWE. And it was never intended to be either. That's the thing. I'm not being like, Ring of Honor couldn't compete with WWE. They weren't trying to. They were doing their own thing. They were doing their small-scale independent. They helped create, like, the boom of independent wrestling, which kind of still lives this day. Let's see how that goes in the next couple of years. So Jeff Jarrett, Bob Ryder, and Jerry Jarrett went fishing in 2001 and pitched this concept of a pay-per-view only wrestling company, because the big issue with World Wrestling All-Stars, the big issue with XWF in the end, was that they couldn't get television and then died. So they were like, how do we circumvent that? We're not going to be able to get TV either, so we're just going to do a pay-per-view only wrestling company, which is a terrible idea. It's just an abysmal, stupid idea, because like the backbone of pro wrestling for the prior like 15 years was, we have our free television on which we will promote live events and we will promote pay-per-view. And that's how you got people to actually watch the pay-per-views. You built the matches on television and then aired the matches on pay-per-view, and people bought the pay-per-view. But without the free television, the free vehicle to promote that pay-per-view, how do people find out about your product? Especially in 2002, where you don't have the hope of gaining internet buzz. Not that the internet didn't exist.
Yeah, because the internet didn't exist, as we all know.
Because we have so many of those posts like, what if the internet existed in 2002?
What if the internet was around when Jeff Jarrett was running a company, eh?
Yeah, he would have been fine. Everything would have went well.
People would have loved it.
Because like so much of the marketing and buzz for these shows did come from the internet. Like you see Jeff Jarrett and Jerry Jarrett and Jeremy Borash doing interviews with the Wrestling Observer, doing extensive interviews with the PW Torch about the founding of this company. That's how they got their word out. But like the internet was not remotely the force it is today. It didn't have social media. Stuff couldn't go viral. If you wanted to get your word out, it's slow slow and steady, and it's through other people's platforms. That's the only way you could do it back in 2002. So the idea of doing this weekly pay-per-view model, where you want to sell a minimum of 50,000 pay-per-views every single week, it was not particularly viable.
Do you think that would be a idea that would function better in 2021? Because, like, you know, a $9 price point isn't the worst.
Well, it's basically like the backbone of the streaming model when you think about it. Like, instead of paying $9 per pay-per-view, you pay $9 a month to Progress, you pay $9 a month to New Japan, and you get all of their shows for the month. So it's more affordable and it's more accessible. So it kind of works now. Like, if New Japan, because the New Japan did charge piecemeal per show, if you remember back in the Ustream days, and people paid it, but not in large numbers. I don't think people would pay for each individual New Japan show, like on a $9.99 like price tag on a show by show basis. I don't think that would work. I don't think people pay for that. But as in terms of like the here's everything and you get all the archives, that does work, and people can find like viable models on both an independent level and a mainstream level with that these days.
I think it's curious too, because there is some examples of companies doing that now. GCW, each show is a single purchase on Fight, and then you go to go back to New Japan, they do like their G1 or their Wrestle Kingdom specials, right, where you buy not each show individually, but it's some sort of overarching price point that you will get all these shows for. So I think it's funny. It's like for an idea that didn't work then, there is still traces of it in 2021's wrestling production.
Yeah, even if you look last year, that NWA offshoot, was it UWF, that Dave Marquez won, basically did the weekly pay-per-view model.
UWF is Glate.
Whatever it was called, it was something. Well, you know the company I'm talking about, the fake NWA that was on pay-per-view last summer.
Yeah, I'll find it. Give me one sec.
So yeah, they literally did the weekly pay-per-view model. They did a pay-per-view every week, and it clearly died a death because they started giving away everything for free like 2 weeks after it ended. So they clearly generated no interest whatsoever, and it didn't work. And like you mentioned GCW, like it is obviously operating on a much smaller scale.
United Wrestling Network.
So UWN, not UWF. I was letter off.
Very different things, though, to be fair.
Hey, if they did shoot fighting between Damien Sandow and freaking Eli Drake, maybe people would have watched it.
You know, I've just clicked on the UWF thing for a little sidebar. A match that happened on UWF Primetime Live 4, Chris Dickinson versus Max Caster.
Well, there you go. Clearly AEW was watching.
Yeah.
Recruiting the UWN talent.
Not the UWF talent. No Minoru Tanaka.
So yeah, they started with the weekly pay-per-view model. I completely forgot where I was after you mentioned Minoru Tanaka. My brain clearly is like, ooh, Minoru Tanaka.
Yeah.
So they decided on that model as like the reason they did it at the end of the day is they had no other option. Like the only other option was to do like a Ring of Honor approach where it's much smaller scale, where it's much more like we're going to build this kind of grassroots promotion from the ground up. It's going to be much more low budget, more based on independent wrestling talent, cheap talent. But they wanted the swing for the fences. They wanted a national company. It was always intended to be a national company. I would recommend there's basically two primary sources now for the foundation of TNA. The one I would most recommend is Jerry Jarrett's book and the foundation and development of TNA, which is very easy to get these days. You can just get it on Amazon. Or like Jeff Jarrett has just done a 3-part series on the foundation of TNA, in which he basically just reads his dad's book and occasionally corrects it, so just buy the book. But I find it interesting. The thing I find most interesting listening to that, aside from the fact that they don't admit basically that the weekly pay-per-view idea was a calamitous mistake that failed very quickly before they were bailed out by Panda. But the thing they don't talk about that kind of drives me mad, they don't talk about what like their actual vision for TNA was supposed to be. We're starting this wrestling company, which is cool. It's a cool idea. You're building this thing from the ground up. You're building this thing. You're creating it. But they had no like clear vision of the kind of product they wanted to offer. There was never like, this is our identity, other than like, we want to be an alternative to WWE. So what does that mean? And if you look at these shows, if you watch these shows, it's like they're not an alternative to WWE. They're a worse version of what WWE did like years before. And it really frustrates me to like, listen, they did like 8 hours of shows, Jeff Jarrett and Conrad Thompson. And at no stage were they like, so, you know, what did you want TNA to be? Like, surely that's one of the most important things you talk about when you found a company, right?
I guess the idea there is that perhaps there was too many people with too varying opinions on what the company was supposed to be.
Which I think goes to an idea that we're an issue that we're going to talk about, I think, a lot throughout this podcast. That actually, if you listen to that Jarrett podcast, it's very clear that him and Jerry were constantly on different pages throughout like the early development of TNA, because Jerry would mention that they were doing one thing, and like this Jerry Jarrett book it was his journal at the time. He was writing a journal while he was founding TNA, and then he published it as a book. So it's like as primary a source as you get. It's the man's journal thoughts the day they happened. And Jarrett's like, oh, some of that never happened. And it's like, it clearly did. It's just your dad was doing things that you didn't know about, or that he just didn't tell you about, which isn't exactly an ideal way to start the company. But also, we'll talk about this again in 2014 TNA, but Vince Russo was kind of secretly working for the company. It's amazing that 2 separate periods in TNA history, there's like Vince Russo shadow booking the company.
If you have to make someone a shadow booker, they're probably not worth bringing in.
It's amazing. It's like, we want you, but no one will like the fact that we have you, so we're not going to tell people. Like, there's this fascinating exchange in a Wade Keller torch talk with Jerry Jarrett, where he's talking about like, and fair play to Wade Keller, who puts him on the spot. He's like, does Vince Russo work for you or collect a paycheck? And Jerry Jarrett's like, no. But then Wade Keller follows up with like, but does he have any creative input to the product? And Jerry's like, well, yes, but no, but yes. And it just comes back to the fact that obviously Vince Russo is a close friend of Jeff Jarrett. Jeff Jarrett's biggest push of his career came from Vince Russo in WCW. So Jeff obviously felt like either he owed Vince Russo something, or that Vince Russo was the best guy to present him on television. And he just couldn't cut him loose. Because like Vince Russo was hired by WWE like days after TNA started. Days after the June 90th pay-per-view. That's when he went back to WWE for like a day before he was fired nearly immediately. But they still couldn't let him go. He's like, he still has to be this foundational part of the company.
He even got a way out.
Yeah, it's like, god damn it.
They still brought him back into the fold.
He could have just been like, oh yeah, Vince, happy for you to go off the W. Because like, if you read Jerry Jarrett's book, we'll get into the quotes because they're later in June 2002. We'll get into the quotes later, specifically about Vince Russo. But he detested Vince Russo.
You know what, Jerry? Me too, man.
He buries Vince Russo 6 feet under multiple times. He's like, this guy doesn't know wrestling. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's stupid. So it's clear that like that friction and that tension existed from the very beginning. That like Jerry Jarrett had this idea of what this company should be, which is like very traditional wrestling. Jerry Jarrett made all his money in Memphis. So that kind of wrestling, that kind of like easy to understand stories, main event guys and main events, opening guys and opening contests. And there'll be some stuff that maybe hasn't aged particularly well that we will talk about when we get to reviewing these shows. That there's some stuff in these shows that are just absolutely vile, honestly.
Which you can also hear our reaction to.
Oh, indeed. Like, go and listen to our on the $10 tier on Patreon, just to hear our visceral reactions to some of the homophobia and racism, because we did a live watch along of NWA-TNA PPV number
and
1.
Ableism. It's all there. It's literally everything that you could hope for.
What do you want? It's literally all in the show. It's clear that like Jerry Jarrett wanted to be more traditional wrestling product. That obviously it ended up being nothing like that, and that ended up actually being one of the key stories throughout the first year of the company: traditional wrestling versus sports entertainment extreme. We'll get to that in months to come. It bled onto the show as a storytelling device. Even the commentary team was apparently kind of designed like that, where Ed Ferrara was meant to be the sports entertainment guy, and Mike Tenay was meant to be the serious sports guy, and they were meant to like argue and clash.
Well, you know what? Despite I don't like Ed Ferrara, I do think he succeeds in that role.
Yeah, he is annoying about pushing sports entertainment on you.
But like, I get it. Like, even from a character perspective, like I think it's fine. Like, if he's the guy who's like going, oh yeah, I like the angles and the blah blah blah, and that's why I'm here, and I'm gonna put that over, and I'm gonna put the heels over. But it also like intrinsically tells the audience that the sports entertainment stuff is garbage.
Yeah.
Because the guy who is voicing that he likes it is the garbage guy on the commentary.
They're at least nice enough to tell you that.
And that's like even a common theme between these first few shows, is that there's a lot of self-loathing on these shows where they seemingly hate their own booking already.
Yep.
they they hate the angles they're putting on there. They hate the show, and they hate this might come from what we're talking about with the everyone has a different view of it. It's like they're burying their own show from the beginning, and I think that was the most interesting takeaway as I was watching too. I was like, why do they hate everything they're putting out there?
I do wonder, is that like, obviously somebody booked the Gauntlet for the Gold for the world title, and then a bunch of people come out at the start of these shows. Like Jeff Jarrett, it's fine. He's the heel. Him coming out and saying, "Oh, I have to win a 20-man gauntlet match to become champion. That's terrible." And then he's given his comeuppance by being made number one in the gauntlet. That's like that works. That makes sense. That's a heel being a heel and getting his comeuppance. But then like Ken Shamrock comes out and it's like, "Yes, Jeff, I agree with you that this is a terrible idea, but I guess we have to do it." Before then, also Scott Hall comes out, both of whom are baby faces, by the way, Scott Hall and Ken Shamrock. Scott Hall also comes out and is like, "Yeah, man, it's such a dumb idea that we're doing this battle royal for the title. Oh, it's so terrible." So I do wonder if it's like deliberate sabotage, that like somebody else is like, "Oh, I'm going to script these promos to bury this booking decision that I don't like."
But it's not even specifically that either. Like there's other things on this show that like the commentary is just shitting on.
Yeah.
It's I don't know. I wonder if there was certain people in other people's ears like, "Hey, Ed, I need you to really shit talk this segment for me. Hey, Mike, can you really bury the sports entertainment stuff for me?"
It is kind of fascinating to see that play out on air, like in a way that's really tangible and clear to see. And like it may be just like they're setting up this story that they're building toward the sports entertainment extreme stuff, where it still doesn't make for particularly compelling television, that pretty much every segment has somebody telling you that part of it sucks for some reason.
Yeah, it's like you can do that and have subtle story tells, but it's like you don't need to bury the show while you're doing it. It's like, especially, it wouldn't even be that bad if it wasn't on TV, but you're asking people to pay a price point every week while telling them the show is bad.
It's such a TNA thing to do from the very start, isn't it?
It's kind of mind-boggling, like how it's almost the worst start to a promotion you could fucking do.
The entire show spends the entire show telling you that the show sucks and you're a dumbass for spending $10 on it and you should never do it again.
And then ends it with, "And we'll see you next week. Make sure you slap them that $10 to go watch Scott Hall and Jeff Jarrett.
So we can bury you again for showing up and watching all this garbage."
Yeah, there's immediately like a test for for their own viewership. It's very odd.
It's remarkable that like disdain for their own audience was there from the very beginning.
Something that WWE has picked up and carried along the finish line.
That's what people don't understand when like I criticize WWE. It's like I am very familiar with all of these signs from the downfall of TNA, and they're repeating them like verbatim, and people are like, "Oh, it's gonna be fine." It's like, and WWE are much more insulated from that because they make way more money than TNA ever did. But the problems are still there, and those problems are very hard to fix the longer you ignore them.
I'm curious, like, if you had to do like a direct comparison point, like, could you what era of TNA is the closest to 2021 WWE from that perspective?
It's probably like 2014, where like everybody every week would come out and say how much the show sucked.
So you mean the era when everyone stopped watching?
Yeah, because like every week there'd be a promo where somebody would like, "Dixie Carter, you're running this company into the ground. This company has so much potential, but you're ruining it." And MVP would cut that promo and then turn heel, and then somebody else would cut that promo on MVP, and it would happen over and over again. That's like everyone knows the show sucks. Nobody is over. Nobody's going anywhere. There's no momentum. Occasionally you get some good matches, but that's about it. And it reminds me so much of 2014 TNA, when the year they got dumped off Spike, which they actually did turn it around the second half of the year. They had some good stuff in the second half of the year, but the first half of that year is just dire. So we talked about the roster. Obviously, they wanted some of the big stars that were available at the time, but couldn't get them. They tried to get Luger. They couldn't get Luger. They approached Bret Hart. There's mention in the Wrestling Observer of a Team Canada that features Harry Smith, TJ Wilson, and Teddy Hart, which like TJ Wilson would have been like 17 at that stage, I think.
I think it's interesting that they clearly had that Team Canada idea from like the beginning.
Yeah, clearly they loved that idea in WCW, the Team Canada that had Elix Skipper in it and Jim Duggan, all the famous Canadians. They wanted to bring it back. They also wanted Randy Savage, but couldn't get him. Sting, couldn't get him either. Steiner was an interesting one in that like Steiner and Jeff Jarrett are best friends. They're huge pals, but they couldn't get him either. Steiner eventually went back to the WWF, or WWE at the time, of course, to beat up Chris Sawinski.
Well, he also had like the Triple H stuff at that point, right? Was that earlier?
No, this was 2002. Steiner was still a free agent. He didn't go back until Survivor Series that year.
Yeah, so he did the World Heavyweight title stuff as well.
Yeah, but TNA would have been long founded by then. But Jeff Jarrett's best pal, he couldn't get him. So, like, when you look at the market, when you look at the names they ended up getting, there's like Ken Shamrock, who's an interesting wrestler, an interesting star, but hasn't been around on a national stage for 2 to 3 years at that stage. So he's not like a big relevant name. Obviously, he's a huge name in the UFC at that stage. He has those fights with Tito Ortiz that year that effectively saves the UFC as like, not only that saves MMA probably. The history of MMA is very different without the Ken Shamrock or Tito Ortiz fights, because if the UFC doesn't make it, it's probably not a mainstream thing these days. So Ken Shamrock was a huge star in the fight world at that stage, but not so much in the wrestling world.
At least he was still on like the tip of people's tongues. Like he was still a name for something.
Yeah, he wasn't a nobody, but. Like, I suppose it would be equivalent to, he's not a CM Punk level star, but Punk hasn't been around wrestling for a long time either, and if he came back, it would be a big deal. So maybe I'm being harsh on Ken Shamrock, but he's the biggest star they have. They couldn't get Sting, they couldn't get Savage, they couldn't get Luger. A lot of these people they did end up getting eventually, for one way or another, for one period or another. Some longer than others. Obviously Steiner and Sting had long runs, whereas Luger and Savage did not. When you take all those people off the table, there's not that much in the way of star power out there anymore. You have Jeff Jarrett, you have Scott Hall, you have Ken Shamrock as people who like people know, and then there's the likes of Rick Steiner and Buff Bagwell, who I think people know but people don't care about.
The Vampire Warrior.
Yes, Vampire Warrior, who wasn't like heavily promoted. He was just announced a few days beforehand as being in the Gauntlet for the Gold, and then never showed up again. Clearly, nobody's a Gangrel fan.
He shot out early, so obviously they can't keep a guy around who can't even obey the rules of the Gauntlet of the Gold.
Shane Douglas, very funny. They were like, Shane, we want you to do the show. And Shane Douglas, Francine was already booked at the time. Shane Douglas was like, it's me or it's Francine. And then they're like, oh, we've already booked Francine, so it's Francine. It's like... the franchise was bragging about that afterwards. It's like, oh, they got Francine, they don't got me. It's like, you just worked yourself out of money there, pal. You're
like
not
in a company that's desperate for stars.
They're literally looking for anybody, and you can talk. So like, you would have been pretty good. I'd imagine they would have taken you, but nope. The franchise at the franchise.
You know, he made his way in eventually.
He did. They all made their way in eventually, except the only one that didn't, that was talked about beforehand, was Bret Hart, who didn't make his way in eventually. But pretty much everybody else did, and. You know, it's a roster. It's such a weird group of people, but it's a group of people.
And to be fair, like there's some stuff in there, you know, even at the early stages. You got the makings of some stuff, but it's definitely a weird assortment of characters.
And like the first person they signed, they signed 2 major wrestlers to long-term contracts, and by long-term contracts we mean 26-day contracts, which at the time was intended to be a 1-year contract, because at launch they intended to do their first show live and then tape a show after that. So that's 1 date for somebody. So that takes everybody they have signed through a year. And the 2 people they signed were Ken Shamrock, who was meant to be their like big ace name.
To be fair, that's a good signing.
As good as they could probably get. Mm-hmm. And then the second one, even better, the phenomenal AJ Styles.
See, that's some good foresight, right?
To be fair, yeah, there's people who will always say to you that TNA didn't know what they had with AJ Styles. And it's like, he was one of the very, very, very few people they signed to a 1-year contract at the start. Like, basically everybody else was signed to either like a 1-show contract, or in the case of Hall, I think it was something like 4 shows. So like the vast majority of people you saw on the very first NWA-TNA show were not signed to long-term deals. That's the way they set this thing up. Like they very much expressly did not want a lot of overheads. So all of their like production, all of their PR, all of that stuff was outsourced, and a vast majority of the talent were signed to short-term deals, which was a big reason people didn't have any faith in it, because one, they were like, oh, you're obviously not confident enough to tie people down, but the second one thing was also like, if any of these people catch on, WWE is just going to sign them because you have none of them under contract. Which WWE didn't do, because WWE were in a weird place during that era where they didn't sign people like AJ Styles.
It wasn't 2020.
Yeah, where it's just like, we're going to hire Robbie E just so nobody else can have him. It is a salient point that if you don't have people tied down, that WWE can just be like, oh yeah, we'll take him, great, thanks for making him a star. But yeah, people argue that they didn't know what they had with AJ Styles, and it's just absolute nonsense, given he was one of the very, very few people they actually signed to a deal.
Well, also, like, I think a lot of people may base that Because on that, like, especially on that first show, they see AJ first match and losing, and they're probably like, whatever. But it's like, even from the first two shows, you can tell that AJ was clearly a guy that they were really high on.
Yep.
Like, he was in that first match, and he was highlighted in that first match.
Well, by being pinned, but sure.
Yeah, but you know what I mean. Like, there was story. At least they had tried to establish a story with him. They gave him times to shine throughout the match. They gave him an out with getting hit before he got pinned, and then immediately on the next show, they had him in the main event with the X title and showing off. Basically, like that entire match was basically just a whole exercise in how to show off AJ Styles to an audience. Mm-hmm. Not a great story for it all, but they clearly liked AJ a lot immediately.
He was clearly intended to be one of the very few people to come out of these first couple shows as like a guy you should actually care about. No, they didn't know what they had with AJ.
Oh, he's already biting it back against the IWC. This is going to be the big feud of this series. It's going to be you taking on everyone online with their tweets on the Twitter machine.
It's basically, this podcast is basically entirely my opportunity to correct the record on people being wrong about TNA.
And then me to like be the realist who goes, yeah, there's a lot of bad.
How dare you?
As we'll get when we get into the actual like more stuff about the shows.
Yeah, if you look at our star ratings, the list is on the $1 tier on Patreon. Basically, all yours are just slightly lower than mine. It's like, hey.
I think I am curious, like going off topic from the formation for a second, on, you know, especially Asylum stuff, like Asylum to, as we said, like what, 09, I have very little knowledge base on. So it's coming in from me going in there, basically watching stuff either for the first time or just the second time, really. And you, like, the foremost TNA guy on the internet. So, like, it's going to be like, you know, I think in general, when it comes to wrestling, you're a little less forgiving than I am, right?
Mm-hmm.
But are we going to reach a point where it's like, oh, Garrett clearly has, like, some nostalgia goggles here. And I'm going to come in here and go, actually...
You were the objective star rater.
Yeah. I am curious to see, like, how much that plays into it. But, like, this wasn't... Like, you weren't watching, like, this era of TNA at the time.
No. It is the era of TNA that I would have the least nostalgia for.
So I expect that to be more around the 05, 06 era. And beyond.
So they wanted a bunch of NWA legends for the opening ceremony to get the belt prestige.
And boy, did they get them.
Well, to be fair, they did get a bunch of them. Like Ricky Steamboat, Harley Race, Dory Funk Jr. Those are good level like NWA stars, people who have strong association with that championship and with that legacy to kind of show up and tell you how important it is. Mm-hmm. They also had Jackie Fargo, Corsica Joe, Sarah Lee, but sure.
They had Jackie Fargo be there for like 5 hours of the first two shows.
I like the way it's like, Harley Race and Dory Funk are much bigger stars than Jackie Fargo. But Jackie Fargo is a bigger local star, perhaps. But like, Jackie Fargo plays a huge role in that show, whereas, like...
That's because Jarrett likes him.
Jeff Jarrett famously ripped off the strut from Jackie Fargo. To be fair, Steamboat also plays a big role.
Steamboat plays a big role on both shows, too.
They also wanted Dusty Rhodes, but Dusty was like, no, I want a lot of money. And also Dusty apparently was like, actually, you're taping 2 shows at once, so this is 2 bookings, not 1. So I want double the money. Fair play to Dusty.
Always a worker.
Dan Severn becomes a big point of contention on the Jeff Jarrett podcast, where it's like, Dan Severn was NWA champion heading into these shows, and the long-held story, the story that's backed up in Jerry Jarrett's book, is that Dan Severn was double booked on the launch date on June 19th. It was not available, so stripped of the title, and they went into the gauntlet match. And the way Jeff Jarrett goes on about it, he did not want Dan Severn on his show. I've never heard a man have more hatred for Dan Severn in my life.
What happened between Dan Severn and Jeff Jarrett?
I don't know. Conrad kind of pokes at him. It's like, what happened here? Why do you... Because, like, it's not like, we have no interest in Dan Severn. It's like, he's like, Dan Severn was not going to be on my show. It's like, whoa, dude.
Do you think Dan Severn beat him up?
He shot on him, yeah. And like, there's such an easy story there because Dan Severn and Ken Shamrock were UFC rivals. So sure, like a really cool match to book would be Dan Severn against Ken Shamrock.
2 pioneers of the sport in the US.
And like, maybe it wouldn't be the most charismatic, dynamic match in the world in terms of like promos and stuff, but it's such an easy story that might actually generate some interest.
A Dan Severn versus Ken Shamrock pay-per-view main doesn't sound like a terrible idea for a company trying to get any and all buzz.
Especially on this, like, your freaking pay-per-view main event ended up being Malice against Ken Shamrock. Like,
Hey!
and I like Malice, but nobody cared about the wall, you know? No one was like, oh, the wall's on the show?
That's why it wasn't pitched as Malice versus Ken Shamrock for the NWA title, was it? Do you have any problem with the Battle Royal for the world title?
I don't. I think it's a perfectly fine way to crown it. Like, I would prefer a tournament. Like, I always prefer a tournament.
Yeah. But if you have to do like a one-day kind of, we got to get it in there and out there. I think I have a less problem with it because it ends in a singles match anyway.
Yeah, the TNA Gauntlet format, which is Royal Rumble, but the last two ends in pinfall and submission.
Which I think might be the best way to do it.
Yeah, WWE should have changed it years ago, but they're too stuck in their ways.
Come on, Casino Battle Royal, just ditch it. Gauntlet for the gold, baby.
Like, realistically, looking at the roster they had, if you were to do a one-night tournament instead of a Battle Royal, the tournament matches would have sucked, you know? You're doing Vampire Warrior against Ken Shamrock,
Malice,
Buff Bagwell against Malice, Rick Steiner against Apollo, you know? I'm trying to put together tournament matches here.
Excuse me, it would be Rick Steiner versus Scott Hall, Jeff Jarrett versus Apollo.
There you go. But like, would you like to see that one-night tournament? I wouldn't. So I'm more on board with the idea of just doing a gauntlet in that case.
I don't know, man. 4 Malice matches is right up my alley.
James Storm and Chris Harris, actually, they were not signed originally. I don't even think they were on people's radar. But on June 1st, on an independent show, they did on a Burt Prentice show, they did a match on that show where TNA were just in the building. They had like Don West and Ed Ferrara there. Jim Cornette also got in a fight with Ed Ferrara on that show for mocking Jim Ross in WCW. But of course.
You know, that rules, actually. Ed Ferrara's getting on my side.
Well, he mocked his Bell's palsy, so it's...
No, damn it, Ed. You couldn't take the high road.
Couldn't just call him a bad announcer or something. But yeah, Chris Harris and James Storm had such a good match on that show. They actually earned their way onto the TNA show and then ended up being very important parts of TNA. So imagine if they just randomly didn't see that Chris Harris James Storm match. I think TNA would be even more dire than it ended up being.
Or if that match was shit. An interesting little factoid about that Storm and Harris match, they actually mentioned it on commentary on the second show.
Yeah. So they were like, these two guys, they're good. And they ended up being good.
Yeah.
So that worked out.
They were pretty good on that second show, actually.
Yeah, they're one of the few redeeming factors about that undercard.
That second show is rough.
We'll get to it. We had the foundation of the commentary team, which Don West was one of the first people brought on. His name was bandied about during the WCW days, but Don West was known as a like television shopping network guy. He was at the Shop on Home network where he sold like sports memorabilia. He was a pitch guy. He was a sales guy. He was once spoofed on SNL by Will Ferrell because that's how like Don West is the most easily spoofable man in the world. But obviously he had never done wrestling before, and I love Don West in this era because he's just so like objectively wholesome and he's so enthusiastic and he
knows nothing about wrestling.
No, he has no idea what's going on. But like AJ Styles does a Hurricane Rana and he loses his mind.
Yeah.
It's the coolest thing he's ever seen in his life and it's so much fun to watch.
I think he'll get better at it, but there's very clearly some times in these first 2 shows where Mike Tenay has to be like, all right, you're giving away the show a little bit here, man. We gotta reel it back slightly. when I forgot who it was. It was in one of the matches. I'm just gonna go through the results real quick to see if I can work it out.
Was it when he was shouting, "It's gotta be Malice"?
Maybe. Yeah, that was a great one. There was another one that I can't remember, but it was some match. I'll just say it was the Brian Christopher K Crush match, right? I don't know if it was, but at one point he just goes like K Crush is on the Heat segment beating him down, and he just goes, Brian Christopher's gonna come back and win.
I love him working out how pro wrestling works in real time. It's like, oh, this is how this works.
And Mike goes to him, well, that's just your opinion. We'll have to wait to see.
Oh, I love Don. It's like, because there's far too much weird cynicism in wrestling commentary these days, where like people who clearly don't like what they're calling or start burying what they're calling. And Don West is just out here losing his mind at literally everything in the most like sincere way possible.
Actually, I don't mind this trio of people at all. I don't like Ed Ferrara in anything other than the commentary, but actual like him just talking shit, I think he's fine.
Scott Hudson was originally considered for play-by-play, but apparently was not available, so they ended up going with Mike Tenay. And also a big thing, apparently Don West was originally supposed to be host of the show, not a color commentator.
You see a bit of that in the first show.
Yeah, because he's actually the first person you see on the first show when he walks out and is like, "Welcome to the show, blah 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 blah." So Don West's role changed from host to commentator. So I think they knew they needed somebody very professional, very knowledgeable to make up for Don West's lack of knowledge. And like the whole idea was like it was Mike Tenay bringing the expert perspective, Don West bringing the fan perspective, and then Ed Ferrara kind of like the entertainment guy. So like Mike Tenay calls holes, tells stories, Don West just shouts and gets excited, and then Ed Ferrara makes some quips and jokes, which is a nice kind of balance. Everybody has a role.
Yeah, I think it works.
And like Mike Tenay is the best. Mike Tenay is so good on these shows, like just so good. And there's people who don't like Mike Tenay, and I will fight them because like he's knowledgeable and he's passionate and he's enthusiastic and like he just nails the big calls and he makes things feel important and he makes like. I think this show would feel a lot more haphazard and a lot less credible if it had an announcer that wasn't as like professional and on it as Mike Tenay was.
Like he's the voice of TNA to me.